recording. So we've got a great panel, a great presentation, and we've got a great audience. And I'm hoping that the audience will participate fully. Once all of the presenters and the respondents have done their stuff, I'll ask you to put up your hands and you can talk live. We can have a rule of putting on your cameras when you talk, but maybe not necessary otherwise. Also, I hope you're going to be active in the chat. And of course, in the chat, you can always say things even while the speaker is talking, and we'll try and pick up some of those conversations as we go along. So thank you all very much for joining. I wanted to go straight into it and call on Ayabonga Kawe to give us a presentation on the overall report that is emerged out of this project. And I really feel he needs no introduction, but I've been asked to. So Ayabonga is a Johannesburg-based development economist, author, columnist, broadcaster, and activist. Many will know him from his excellent talk show on Metro FM, and many of us look forward to his weekly column in the Business Day. He serves as a part-time special advisor at the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. And he previously served on the Minimum Wage Advisory Panel and the VAT Zero Rating Review Panel. And of course, he's also a member of the Presidential Advisory Council. So he's a policy advisor. He must add to that list of economist, author, columnist, broadcaster, activist, policy advisor, and all-round good guy. Ayabonga, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I always say it feels like my obituary is being read whenever a bio like that is read. And my task really, afternoon, once again, colleagues, my task really is a simple one, although an unenviable one, to try and summarize the very rich contributions that have come out of this particular project with SCIS. Now, one of the things that Michael has not read is that I'm also a research associate at SCIS. So I must make sure that at least that particular credential comes through correctly. And yeah, I've also, alongside Michael and Imran, been trying to put together a chapeaux or overview paper that really tries to harmonize the different contributions that have come through from many of our contributors who are with us, some of whom are with us on this call. So I'm going to share my screen quickly as I go through this. You will let me know when you can see my screen. Can you see it now?
We see your screen.
Yes. Okay, good. So I guess, yeah, the starting point and the title of our chapeau paper is Dancing in Concert, and really aiming to align B-BBEE to sector strategies, structural transformation, and growth. And the big question mark, of course, is nearly 30 years later, what have we achieved? And Black economic empowerment, as Professor Valodia has just said, has probably been one of the more ambitious approaches trying to place economic power, racial redress, and the ownership of assets and wealth at the center of the discourse. And this becomes very important in a country like South Africa with the type of history that we come from. But also, there's been particular phases and stages in the evolution of broad-based Black economic empowerment policy that have looked to really change the racial and gendered consequences of settler colonialism and apartheid. And really, this is done through a focus on ownership, managerial control, and the acquisition of skills and the broadening and opening up of economic opportunities. Now, despite the existence of multiple instruments to achieve these objectives, be it industry scorecards, set-asides, preferential procurement, legislative, and many other legislative instruments, there seemingly remains a growing criticism around the utility of BEE as a program around which a development strategy can potentially cohere. And in many ways, a lot of people have felt that it's too narrow, it feeds those who are politically connected, and is in many ways dislocated from the type of market structure and structural transformations that need to happen in the South African economy. So in many ways, this book is really about that, or this contribution, I should rather say, of this chapeau paper and many of the papers that it draws from, are really considering that, looking at how do we, at an operational and at a market, product and service market level, think about broad-based Black economic empowerment, and how does it allow us to achieve the objectives of really having a clear way of influencing the technological and structural changes that are happening all around us. And of course, a starting point, certainly for us, as we think about an overview paper, is to try and think of this in space and in time. So the different periods in the development of Black enterprise that are worthy of consideration. And of course, the starting point has to be around the discovery of minerals in South Africa in the late 19th century and the imposition of capitalist relations that, of course, enable the development of particular systems of social control, a race-specific division of labor, and of course, the associated distributional mechanisms and consequences of that particular social environment. And of course, despite some early shifts, in the direction of a path towards accumulation for many Black entrepreneurs, by the late 19th century, we see in the work of Bandi, the work of Archie Mafeche, this notion that Black producers were starting to establish themselves in a shifting and a changing society. And a big part of the 20th century, Union of South Africa, and of course, the onset of Afrikaner nationalism, and the involvement of the National Party in state power was really about trying to stem and to stall and to delay this accumulation path through non-market forms of discrimination and coercion. We mentioned in the Chapeaux paper a very interesting example of Tennyson Makiwane. Now, we made mention in the Chapeaux paper to say, this is not the other Tennyson Makiwane who was part of the Gang of Eight who were expelled from the ANC after the Morogoro conference. But this is, we understand, of course, his father, who are all progenitors of another entrepreneur and pioneer journalist, one Elijah Makiwane. And they, at the time of the 1930 Native Economic Commission during the Great Depression, gave testimony at the hearings in Mthatha, and they were talking about the agricultural development of that area, and in particular, some of the cooperatives that were operated and controlled by Africans in that part of the world, and some of the challenges that they faced, the representations they had made to the union government to be incorporated into mechanisms that would also allow them, just like white producers would have access to a land bank, to really, I guess, provide credit and provide credit lines that deal with these discontinuities between production and investment, and of course, subsequently, I guess the risks associated from planting seed in the ground right up until harvest. And that's an important consideration because what we already start to see in that testimony before the Native Economic Commission is already massive savings in and investment activity by some of these cooperatives. One, I think, was sitting on around £2,000, which is over just 2 million in 2020 rands, which is not marginal by any stretch of the imagination, if you consider the level of deposits that are in some of the licensed cooperative financial institutions that are licensed by the Prudential Authority in the contemporary moment. Now, of course, also during the apartheid era, and with the balkanization of the society in the form of homelands, native reserves before then, from 1948 or so, we saw the National Party seeing Black empowerment, or the empowerment of aspirant entrepreneurial Black class in the homelands, as a critical part of their grander project of apartheid. So in a way, while they continued to offer market support to white producers, they effectively drip-fed the commercial ambitions of some of the politically connected elements in the Black homelands. And Pagamisa Nzamela's piece, from which the Chapeaux paper draws on, speaks even about, I guess, the early experiences in the development of the Xhosa Development Corporation after the passing of the Bantu Investment Corporation Act in 1959. Now, during apartheid, the DFIs, such as the Industrial Development Corporation, were able to use instruments like concessional loans, import credit schemes, and equity investments to fund industrialization in the Republic. And in contrast, in the Black homelands, industrial experiments in places like Garankuwa, Isithebe, and Mandeni, Ezbeleni, and others were really used for more for political and social and population control rather than for economic purposes. And the experience in many ways of Black economic empowerment in the homelands involved the creation of a raft of development and investment corporations that did what we also saw, I guess, in the latter years in the 1990s, which is to finance the transfer of erstwhile white-owned small businesses, anything from a store trader right up to, a mill that keeps animal feed, and finance the transfer of those businesses from white-owned operators to new Black owners. And we can see there in that graph on the left-hand side, just the capital structure as of 1983, and 1981, right up until 1983, I should rather say, of some of the development corporations. And it becomes quite clear that, the Transkei Development Corporation and that existed in Bophuthatswana probably had the larger assets relative to, say, the ones that were out in Kwakwa or in Leboa or Gangwane or in Venda. And similarly, much of the debt funding came from the CED and the South African Development Trust and the Small Business Development Corporation, which held equity in many of these homeland-based transport, agriculture, retail, and other companies. And similarly, the IDC, of course, that SBDC emerges as a subsidiary of the IDC and had a significant amount of assets at the time, also incorporating the Indian and colored development corporations as well. But what becomes clear is if you look at the numbers, the total net assets of some of these development corporations, and you compare them to the extent of the investments by the IDC and later on the Development Bank of Southern Africa into what were called the industrial decentralization areas, it becomes clear that the Development Corporation was really about funding, I guess, a particular layer in the homeland society. But the real injections, the industrial injections, were largely linked to, white, in some cases Afrikaner, and later on Taiwanese firms who were making investments into the border decentralization areas. And this was about giving them support, anything from railage support, incentives around electricity. There were even wage incentives, right up to capital support, and even some of the other industrial incentives as well. Now, of course, all of this happens in a context where there are emerging different notions of what Black empowerment is. And in the latter part of the 1980s, much of what we see even in the business and financial news around Black empowerment and the early references to it in reference to the taxi industry and the new markets they would exploit is rooted around trying to mobilize Black consumption and savings to achieve economic power and to build institutions for economic support. And rather than this particular interpretation in the late 80s, the early 90s and the experiences of early post-apartheid period of the early BEE deals was associated with what some might suggest is this narrow, minimalist, capital reform type of approach, which focused on the creation of a capitalist class among the Black majority. And we saw a lot of these deals employing complex financial engineering, special purpose vehicles, and of course the role of third-party debt to facilitate the transfer of economic interest from white firms to Black owners. And of course, the other element of the economic transfer was in instances where corporate restructuring led to privatizations of product and service markets that might have been historically during apartheid the preserve of state-owned entities. And this creates a tension, because the tension now is between the narrow self-interest of some of the Black capitalist class, or the few potential Black capitalists who might emerge at the tail end of this process, and the national imperatives of reinvestment in further rounds of accumulation on a different basis to what we had during apartheid. And this, I guess, contradictory position, both on the one hand of this patriotic bourgeois vis-a-vis a very, comprador and extractive, and what some might suggest is a parasitic bourgeois, has continued to be a defining part of the public debate around this issue. And these tensions arise around capital accumulation, consumption, investment, and the interface between these and the project of national development. And of course, these tensions, far from being resolved, require South Africans to think about BEE not just as something that is around changing the racial and demographic composition of who owns capital and who decides and who makes decisions around the allocation of capital. But it's also about thinking about these within the broader political economy and macroeconomy of South Africa. So while the first wave of deals might have focused just on transferring ownership and managerial control at a firm level, the later phases have really been around focusing on systemic, legislative, and regulatory changes that underscore the importance of creating new economic interests. So it's not just about the transfer of existing stakes in existing firms, but rather the creation of new economic interests through enterprise development, supplier development, acquisition of skills, deconcentrating critical parts of the economy, and also confronting the occupational and the pay distribution and the implications, of course, of apartheid wage gaps on that occupational and income distribution. We've also seen, and I think the work of Tuma Kubule is quite instructive on this score, that the role of macroeconomic variables, exchange rates, interest rates, the terms of trade influenced largely by the export prices of the commodities we export, have all had direct impacts on the payoffs to Black groups that have been part of the many narrow BEE deals that we've had in a particular phase in the evolution of broad-based Black economic empowerment. And so in a sense, a big part of the overview paper is about exploring from the rich pieces of work that have been done by many colleagues across a wide range of sectors, from the automotive sector through to agro-processing and to many other sectors. It's about looking at how do we make sure that as we widen the scope, there's a complementary focus on the micro and macroeconomic influences that influence how Black firms, large and small, are able to respond to and actively influence the direction of structural and technological change in the society. And this requires that we consider and we also clarify the type of instruments that we have to achieve the objectives, but it also requires a clarification of the role definition of different institutions, and significantly also the distributional features of what we want to achieve, and by extension, how we go about measuring this and how and what success looks like. And in a way, despite some advances, there are still many, very much the key features of the earlier colonial and homeland experiences of Black empowerment or disempowerment. And this includes, as we often see in many of the deals that are announced, the continuing presence of leveraged acquisition of stakes in target firms, an ambivalent role of development finance institutions to some of this work, and sometimes I would argue the uneven focus on this. And in addition to this, the deepening concentration in key product and service markets. So in a way, BEE continues to be confronted by the ghosts of old at a micro and at a macroeconomic level. And significant gaps remain in our understanding and measurement of the changes that are happening in firms in these product and service markets. And we still have a very strong over-reliance on macro spend measures. In some cases, it seems like we think impact is synonymous with how much we have spent, without any assessment of some of the qualitative implications of some of our actions. And of course, from a sectoral distribution perspective, and an interesting piece of work is in the volume of pieces we've worked on in competition and in the automotive sector, that indicate that the sectoral distribution of transformation, if we think of it in narrow ownership terms, has really remained weak and uneven outside of the minerals energy complex, or outside of where the areas where the state has some responsibility for the distribution of rents by way of licensing, procurement, and other interface points with the state spending. And therefore, in many of these instances, structural transformation of secondary industry, in particular, critical subsectors of manufacturing and even some sectors in the service sector, require not only just the spread of ownership, but also the deepening of the participation of Black players in value-adding activities, and the use of competition and industrial policy to facilitate market entry, to expand markets, and to also ensure coordinated investment along key value chains, while also stemming the abuse of market power by many dominant firms in many of these key product and service markets. Just as I conclude, in many ways, and we argue this in the overview or chapeaux paper, that the narrow definition of empowerment has reached a cul-de-sac. And I think this is important because it then frames the type of academic inquiry, or even, I guess, the type of intellectual inquiry that we might want to undertake into the evolution of BEE. That there has to be this recognition that it has evolved beyond just this narrow, picking out of the deals and linking those to a few people that might be connected in some shape or form to the powers that be and the people who make decisions. But also there's been a significant amount of social pressure to widen the scope of application of broad-based Black economic empowerment and the scope of who is seen as a designated party that can participate. And the chapeaux paper, without running the risk of giving away too much that is in it, because we still want you to go out and read it, the chapeaux paper and the contributions from which it draws really are not just about revisiting the criticisms of broad-based Black economic empowerment, which is important, and some of the papers do so, but rather it's about proposing a new prism for really calibrating, trying to make sense and take stock of the transformational ideals that are embedded in our notions of Black economic empowerment, and also the transformational outcomes and how we understand those, how we make sense of those, in a way that goes beyond just the targets we set and the narrow payoffs that go to the special purpose vehicles associated with particular groups. We also argue that BBBEE has to go beyond just solely pushing, in the case of what we've just mentioned with industrial and competition policy, pushing for market entry, pushing for structural transformation. While important, it has to go beyond this, and it has to go beyond this in terms of its focus beyond just the traditional sectors, but look to how it facilitates the participation, the entry, and even the pioneering moves of Black players in the development of subsectors or economic activities that are linked to new industries that are associated with key social and structural transitions that we faced with, be it the digital transition, be it the notion of a just energy transition, be it some of the transitions that are implied by a broader ecological and climate sensitivity. But more importantly, I think also, if we think about the pharmaceutical space and the implications of a global public health crisis, and if these crises are set to continue, what then becomes the implications of Black involvement in the pharmaceuticals value chain beyond just, what some might argue is just, I guess, Western pharmaceutical value chains, but even making use of indigenous knowledge systems and other elements to make sure that there's broad and effective participation by historically disadvantaged persons in many of these value chains. I think the last comment then is, and this is a big message that comes out from the overview paper, is that our notions of empowerment must respond not just to the racial and demographic considerations. Those are critical, yes, but they must also be able to be conversant and give due consideration and be informed by the structural shifts and the technological and other changes that are happening in our society that are also, I guess, happening in a context of considerable uncertainty and what we argue in the paper is unparalleled social change. So I'm going to pause there. And once again, thank you for the opportunity to present some of the ideas that have emerged in the paper, and of course, some of the ideas that have emerged in the rich contributions that many colleagues from which the chapeaux paper has drawn on have so generously contributed to. Thank you very much, Program Director.
Thank you so much, Aya. Lumkile, I see your video is on, but I wanted to invite our other respondents. I wanted to give you the last word and invite Mr. Jacob Maputa to join us. He is the Chief Director and Head of Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment at the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. And since joining the public service, his area of focus and passion has always been the development and implementation of policies and strategies for the transformation and growth of the South African economy. His main role is to provide strategic direction and guidance on the BEE policy, both in the public and private sector. So Jacob, I hope you are with us and ready to go.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. We really appreciate it. It's very good to, always good to listen to well-researched, work and the paper. And thank you to Ayabonga and the team for a balanced, well-written paper I believe it provides a balanced view and critique of where we are as a country with regard to our transformation journey. And I think being a policymaker, our starting point is that to enable participation of Black people in the mainstream economy requires government intervention. I think to us there's no doubt about that as long as government does not play an active role in ensuring that there is a transformation, that is not likely to happen. But also we recognize that for that to happen, you also need partnership. You need national effort by all stakeholders, including labor, business, and as well as civil society. If you look at some of the successful empowerment processes, they actively encourage involvement of all social partners, especially the participation of community, civil society, and of course business as well as labor. So that is very important for us. It's in a way acknowledging that markets only will not solve our socioeconomic development problems. So again, they need to be an intervention. So, but what is BE and why BE? I think Ayabonga has already highlighted some of those. We say that BE is one of the key policies that have been designed to basically transform the economy. But also at the same time, BE is not a silver bullet, not going to solve all our socioeconomic challenges. That is why you have other policies, you've got other programs on affirmative action. All of those are aimed at creating an economy that is inclusive. So our role as government, obviously, in this journey is to ensure that we create a conducive and enabling environment. Yes, government must intervene, but our role in the main is not to implement. Our role is to ensure that we develop policy, we develop guidelines, we give direction, through strategy and so forth, obviously in consultation with social partner. And also coupled with that is to ensure that we invest in social services, such as education, health, physical infrastructure, and so forth. So that's our main role, really, to ensure that the environment is conducive for the private sector in the main to be able to implement, the transformation. And of course, we then have to monitor that, are we making progress, and what are some of the the implementation gaps. I believe that and I think this is a wide range belief that we do have the right tools as a country. We do have the right legislation in BEE and other frameworks, as well as policy. But I think what is lacking is that jointly, government and other social partners, we need to work towards implementing aggressively and such policies and making sure that we make the right. I think time and over and again, it is said that as South Africa, we do not lack policy per se. We do not lack frameworks. What we lack is a drive, a right drive towards ensuring that there is proper implementation. And with BE, despite all its gaps that have been highlighted, we still, I believe, have the right framework that we can be able to use to create an economy that is growing, but also that promote wider participation. So in addition to some of those things that were highlighted by Ayabonga, what are some of those things that we have observed that are gaps, in this journey? Why do we still experience narrow empowerment, as the paper highlights, and other challenges? I think the first thing, arguably, is that there is not enough, accountability. We don't hold each other accountable, social partners. As I said, as government, obviously, our main role is to create policy, but jointly as social partner, we need to be able to hold each other accountable with regard to the success or the failure thereof of B-BBEE. It's not only that we can point finger as a government, but collectively, we need to be able to say, why are we failing? Why, for example, the report by the B Commission shows that at least 27% of corporates in South Africa are non-compliant with regard to to BE. 27%. I mean, it's a huge, it's a huge number, and only about 5% are performing at the highest level of compliance, which is what we call level 1. Obviously, levels are just a measure of, and the scorecard are just a measure of the activities. The key thing is to look at impact, but at least the statistic shows that there is still high level of non-compliance and dragging of feet with regard to BE compliance. So those are some of the gaps. The other key issue, I think that we need to highlight, maybe it was not highlighted, the issue of the economy. As I said, BE, we need to look at BE in terms of the overall economic policy of the country. And I think one of the challenges that we've been faced with as a country is the fact that the economy has not been growing sufficiently. The past few years we've been growing at around 1% and so forth. So that in its own has made not easier for the implementation of policies such as your B-BBEE. And of course, even at the time when we were growing in the early 2000s at around 5% or so, we didn't really see much of acceleration with regard to transformation. So I think yes, we need to ensure that the economy is growing, but also at the same time ensure that the kind of that growth and the investment to be reaped out of that is channeled correctly, and that we use it to ensure that we reduce our inequality. So economic growth, in fact, I think that should be one of the things that and of course BE can contribute to the economic growth, but as I said, it's not only an isolated policy. We need to look at it within the broader context of other policies. I think the other challenge or issue that I wanted to highlight, the issue of access to finance. I think as South Africa, we have one of the lowest, South Africa is low in terms of credit expansion. There hasn't been enough credit towards micro enterprises, the SMMEs and so forth. And I think within the greater context of BE implementation, you need to ensure that there is a credit that is accessible to be able to build, small businesses. And I think we need to, yes, our DFIs have been doing a lot of work here, but also we need to look at what is the role of the financial service sector as a whole? You know, has they done enough through their transformation process, the financial charter, to ensure that there is affordable enough credit available to be able to fund, you know, B-BBEE. We can have all these good policies and so forth, but if there isn't available, credit that is available or finance, we will not be able to, you know, to achieve what we need to be able to achieve. So we need credit, you know, systems that will enable access to finance for small businesses, as I said, and ensuring that, coupled with that, incubation programs that will enable those small businesses to be able to, to grow. Now, I think the paper also raises a critical issue around, sectors. I think, in my view, what is lacking is that, yes, with BEE, we do have targets that needs to be achieved and so forth. But if you break it down to a sectoral level, we don't have enough, should I say, clear targets with milestone and so forth with regard to what various sectors of the economy want to, to achieve. In other words, I'm saying that in the mining sector, beside the fact that we say we want to transform the mining sector to 30% as an example, but beyond that, what else do we want to achieve? How many mine owners, black mine owners, do we want to, to effect in that sector? What is the, within the time frames as well? So I think what is lacking is that we don't have clear targets with, with milestone within the various sectors, so that we're able to hold each other accountable to that. All what we have, is open-ended targets through charters and so forth, but that are not broken down into various milestones. And I think that the various master plans that are being developed, are trying to introduce that, to say that stakeholders within the various industry need to have clear targets, clear milestone with regard to what do we need to, to achieve. Do we want to achieve a black industrialist in the renewable energy, as an example? How many and how are those black industrialists going to be, So I think we need to simplify it, and say each and every industry, each and every sector should be able, from a transformation point of view, say, what is it that needs to be achieved, and those sectors or industry must be held accountable to that. And I think that the auto industry perhaps is one good example of what they have done through their master plan, and lately with the transformation fund that they established to be able to achieve the goals of that master plan. So let me stop here. I think those are some of my initial thoughts on some of the issues that I think are like. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Jacob. And I would now call Lumkile. While he's coming on, I'll also thank Bandile and Nkateko and Megan and Jabulani, who have all commented with very interesting, all of them comments in the chat, which we will come back to later. But Lumkile, they didn't give me your CV. So what I can say is that Lumkile Mondi is our colleague teaching with us at WITS at the School of Economics and Finance. He is known to many of you as an industrial policy expert. He recently completed his PhD on ESCOM. And he's also an author of one of the contributions to this project. And for those who may have come late, we were not planning to have a panel, but that's where we've ended up, and partly because Lumkile agreed at the very last minute to step in for Tabi Lioka, who unfortunately is not well. So Lumkile, please give us your thoughts on the conversation so far.
Thank you very much, Michael, and also to my colleagues that have come before me, specifically trying to share some thoughts and ideas. I must say, Ayabonga, the chapeau is really enjoyable and a beautiful read. I think given the number of articles that you had to go through and the product that you produce, is really brilliant. I just want to start firstly making a comment that relates to the importance of the colonial domination and the early parts of apartheid, which the chapeau start with. Here, I think what you need all of us to realize is the importance of the transition in Marxist terms, from feudal system towards sharpening the forces of production. So what I'm saying, colleagues, is that what the British had brought in the introduction of new relations in Southern Africa specifically was to try and sharpen the forces of production, basically meaning that the nature of capitalist social relation will play a very critical role and continue today in shaping the means and process by which people organize their lives outside the specific economic wage and labor as well as capital relation, because of the majority of the people cannot access the means of producing their own subsistence except by seeing their labor in the services. So this becomes very, very important in the chapeau in terms of really showing the disposition of Black Africans. Of importance is the role of Lord Milner following the union formation, and how Milner goes out to demarcate and begins a process of racial segregation, but at the same time start eroding even the meager wage that Blacks are getting. More revealing, colleagues, is also how the Communist Party of South Africa tries very, very hard, fitting within the emerging Milner concept of racial segregation by organizing exclusively white workers. In fact, thinking that they're trying to sharpen these forces that they saw that could transform the emerging capitalist social relations in South Africa towards socialism. Some of the members of the party had seen from Russia and countries around Russia. So we see the racialization of the capitalist South African economy starting much earlier on. So Nzamela, which Abonga, you presented his perspective very, very well, and even in the article that's contained in the whole chapters that the chapeau is taking away from, makes this point very, very clear around how Africans are being dispossessed, particularly in the Eastern Cape through the Bantu Investment Corporation. However, this is the period, colleagues, following 1948, it's around 1959, when the Bantu Investment Corporation Act was enacted. But I think what is important is, again, to realize that once the National Party comes into power in 1948, it's very clear about the nature of the capitalist development, that is going to be exclusively a white accumulation process, but more importantly, is going to have a very strongly racial character. And therefore, the process accumulation is informed by what Hosel refers to as the apartheid project. So the reversal of all these gains that Phakamisa Nzamela talks to are part of the apartheid project. White empowerment, exclusively marginalizing African people, and in the process, forging divisions within the African people through the homeland system, and giving those willing to sell out the power to form homelands, which Ayabonga in the chapeaux talks to very brilliantly. I think, colleagues, what we then don't talk about, which I thought maybe in the chapeau, the Abonga will talk to it, is also the tension that we see later on between the Black liberation movements, particularly in the early 70s period, and Black entrepreneurs, particularly when it comes to resisting white domination and the emergence of boycotts, stayaways, and things like, and I quote, etolopeni asteni, how those new relations that emerge that cause a lot of tension between liberation comrades, but also Black business, where Black business, which Abonga argues, as well as my colleagues within the chapeau, that this form of Black alliance and mutual support was beginning to strengthen Black business around certain key subsectors, such as hawking, taxi operation, taverns, construction or building, and hairdressing. I think this from an article that within the bigger book written by Kubule. But these colleagues, in the face of a regime which is being resisted, also create that complication between the liberation movements and Black business. So what I'm arguing, colleagues, is that the nature, therefore, of the post-apartheid Black economic empowerment should be understood within the compromise that was achieved in the period between 1990 and 1994. And around the macroeconomic compromise, as people have argued, such as Padeachi and Van Niekerk, even Habib for that matter, who argue that there were other options which we could have embarked upon than agree to the continuation of what Among was referring to as the minerals and energy complex. And therefore, the compromise itself reinforces the oligopolistic and monopolistic nature of the minerals and energy complex. And unfortunately, the ANC and many progressive organizations see the only way of bringing Blacks into the macroeconomy is through whites giving away handouts through Black economic empowerment schemes, which Tuma Kubule and many of our colleagues that Abong was referring to in the chapeau so eloquently talked to. But what we don't see, colleagues, within that is that even though this empowerment begins earlier on before 1994, but also in the period in schemes that Tuma Kubule talks to, including companies like Whiphold, Nozala Pamuts, and many others. These schemes, colleagues, aren't necessarily talking to breaking down the oligopolistic as well as the monopolistic nature of our economy. what they do, they bring these black shoulders in to deepen the strength of the existing oligopolistic and monopolistic companies, basically giving them a black face so that they could be able to be seen to have transformed, when in fact it's just shuffling the pack with no meaningful transformation taking place. Of importance, colleagues, is then being faced with these difficulties where those that are lucky are able to be absorbed into these empowerment schemes that Duma and others talk to, that Abonga is referred to. How do we transform then the economy, given that we are basically going into these schemes to reinforce and deepen the minerals and energy complex? And some of the blacks outside see no other way but to see the state as a vehicle for black participation. So the Preferential Procurement Act allows or gives opportunities to black entrepreneurs who in fact were not lucky enough to get to the big deals that colleagues talk to, but therefore the only way for them to accumulate in the face of oligopolistic and monopolistic companies that unbear to black shareholders who have shut the door, that the only way probably is through the state. And this, colleagues, is being seen in a very positive light as the radical economic transformation. And many people are arguing that actually what you've seen in the past 40 years in China, where SOEs in China, state-owned companies, have been instrumental in the transformation of China, in small businesses being part of this transformation and accumulation process in China, that perhaps in South Africa, we can be able to emulate what we've seen in China. So here, I want to borrow from one of the Chinese scholars, Yuan Ang, who talks about what we've witnessed in China as the Gilded Age. And she argues that actually, if you look at China, there are 4 critical areas that have defined the Gilded Age of China, whereby China has been very successful in growing double digit, and at the same time with deep corruption. So for some reason, China presents a paradox of high levels of economic growth, but deeper corruption. So taking those lessons back home, Yuan Ang gives us 4 types of corruption. Gives us the usual one that you know of bribery, that you see from time to time. But the 2 most important one, colleagues, which I want to highlight are the one about speed money. Speed money, colleagues, is what you pay to get in front of the queue. And then talks about access money. Access money is what in China, many of the regional leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, in partnership with Chinese SOE leaders, cooperate and create stash of money to support the candidacy of the Communist Party. I'm describing this phenomenon, colleagues, because this is what we see with the radical economic transformation program in South Africa of trying to empower, where you're trying to bring others in, but in the process, you deepen corruption, the state institutions are repurposed, and eventually there's very, very little left for development and economic participation. So what you see is a process whereby the articulation was something progressive, but it doesn't. So in conclusion, colleagues, because I see Michael is looking at me, in conclusion, I want to say that the importance of shifting from radical economic transformation is the importance of the Black Industrialist Program. That for the first time, we've got an opportunity to move away from what Kobulek describes of blacks coming into these companies, reinforcing monopolistic and oligopolistic behavior. The second part being the capture of the state, the Chinese way, but without development. And now the third wave, underpinned black industrialists, where the state, where the IDC and other institutions are able to support black participation and the transformation in the sectors that Ayabonga articulated, from the green industries, pharmaceutical, agriculture, and many more. That is going to inform the economy of the future that we so much wish going forward. Thank you so much, Michael. Sorry I took longer.
No, you were perfectly on time, Lumkile, and thank you very much to you. Just to note, in case you missed it, in the chat, Kitso, our spokesperson, posted the link to both the report that Ayabonga has presented, but also a number of other papers. I'll just show you here how it looks on the website. So there's that, the chapeaux report, and for those of you who might not be French, chapeau it means a hat. So it's the thing that's supposed to summarize all the other papers. We also have papers by Pagamisa and Zamela that have been mentioned. Kwok Aun Lee on the South Korean example, and he is in our audience today. We have papers by Alex Mashilo and Renai Mutilal on the auto sector. Duma Kubule has also been mentioned. Michel Joubert, an interesting paper on how we measure Black empowerment. One by David Francis and Imran Valudia on the labor market. One on competition policy and BEE by Liberty Mnube and Hardin Ratsisusu. And then we have Lumkile's paper, one on education by Victor Halema, who I see is also in the audience, and Stephanie Alay and Kamel Maroc. Industrial policy by Sumeya Hoja and Elvis Avenio. And lastly, the agri-sector, and by Mzukisi Kobo and Wandile Siklobo. So I want to open the floor to discussion, and you are most welcome to raise your hand and articulate any questions or comments you might have on what has been presented. But if you don't want to do that, and if nobody raised their hands, I will just mention while you're thinking about it that in our chat, Bandile has raised the issue of power. And in a sense, perhaps he's asking, and I see Ayabonga has replied to him, but perhaps he's posing the question, if BEE has not been a success, has failed, is that baked into our political settlement? In other words, do we need a fundamental change in power relations in order to have a better project of BEE? So my sense from what colleagues have contributed so far is almost that the central issue that we face as a country is the issue of structural change. And people might have different ideas about what structural change means, whether it's a kind of liberalization of markets or more state intervention. We can argue about that. But I think it's common cause that we have not seen sufficient change in the structure of the economy over the last 30 years. And we have also not seen sufficient economic growth. And perhaps I can pose the question that in the absence of effective structural transformation, economic transformation, and in the absence of growth and improvements in productivity, is it possible to have any serious program of Black economic empowerment succeed? So is the failure of BEE, if it is failed and if it is in a cul-de-sac, a result of BEE or a result of the failure of the broader project of economic change and growth in South Africa? Maybe I can pose that question to Jacob Maputa from DTIC and ask, would you agree with this assertion in Ayabonga's presentation that narrowly defined BEE has reached a cul-de-sac?
Yeah, Yeah. Look, the acceptance is that BEE must be broad-based. In other words, one, we must make sure that we empower as many people. That is why lately you will have seen in most of the transactions we have been advocating for participation of workers, excuse me, communities and so forth. Number two, that we need to move away from the notion and dispel the fact that BEE is only seen as being about ownership. Yes, ownership is important. The very first objective of BEE is to, change the current ownership patterns. But BEE is beyond ownership. BEE is about ensuring that we build, executive, we build capacity within employees, give young people opportunities. It's about ensuring that we create market access, for small enterprises are owned by women, by young people, and so forth. So I believe that the current framework, as I mentioned earlier, has got very good elements, that if we were to embrace them, if we were to implement such, it can go a long way in ensuring that, some of those things that Ayabonga and Mondi mentioned, can be achieved. But as I said, we need to, the future of BEE is ensuring that we focus sharply at industry level. We start to unpack value chains, different value chains of industry. And I mentioned the fact that the automotive industry have already started with that through their master plan. So I believe we need to be able to, each industry, really bring it closer to home, analyze each of and every a value chain, including new industries in artificial intelligence, green energy, and so forth, and start to unpack those and say, where are the opportunities to be able to, to ensure that there is, empowerment, especially with new industry or new emerging industry, because it's very much easier to be able to, from the onset, create opportunities and ensure that you bring on board the empowerment from the onset. So I believe the framework in its definition and construct, it promotes broad-based participation, but I think it's the interpretation and how it has been implemented that at times it's being viewed as being promoting narrow participation. Thanks.
So I see Megan has asked in the chat, is it possible to reconcile the commitment to a framework like BEE, which attempt to improve capitalism, with the desired goals of more equality, redress, redistribution, real transformation? Or is inequality embedded in this model? In other words, is BEE really about, I suppose, let me not say in other words, because the author may disagree with my words now, but is it really about fundamental transformation? Or is it about marginal improvement while retaining the really massive inequality that we have between maybe the most affluent 10% in this society and the rest of the population? I don't know if you've seen the recent work of Arup Chatterjee and others at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies that shows how the Black affluent have become an increasingly important part of the affluent 10% of society, but with the majority remaining poor and inequality becoming worse. So I've been busy trying to find a way of provoking people, and I see, fortunately, I've provoked Kanti Pai, who I invite now to make some input for us.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Am I audible?
You are audible.
All right, thanks very much, Michael. Taiwo for that.
It will be wonderful to see you too, but
oh. Am I visible now? Just for a greeting, and then I'll go back to so that the bandwidth actually works with me. I thought just maybe two things. The first one is this idea of that we need growth to be able to empower Black people, or for Black empowerment to work. I don't know if I understood it correctly, and I thought it was actually the other way around. That actually what you want is more inclusion. Then if you included people, then you would have more power. And I think there's been some interesting work that's been coming out from different places. I know the most probably recent some works from in the IMF, in which they argue that the exclusion of women, for example, at a national level is very clear in terms of foregone growth or GDP. It's also true of minorities. But I wanted to sort of comment on what something that I thought was really fascinating that in Ibonga's presentation really caught my attention, because he uses an interesting historical lens in terms of what was a kind of, and I hope I understood him properly when he says, that some of these schemes, or I guess what we would call now empowerment deals, were sometimes about actually, relieving, buying assets from, certain groups of people. So from white people, they would actually, and then you're transferring assets, or you're transferring what may not actually have been productive. And then he also talks about some of the schemes that have been happening. And I thought that the interesting thing about that is that historical lens perhaps gives us a lot of insight about where we are and where we are likely to end up. And it's not something I would have thought about, that actually, if we reflect back and we look at what is happening, it seems to me that there is a lot of, there's not so much a lot to learn, but there's a lot to connect. There's a big thing now here in this country about connecting the dots, that it allows us to actually see where we are and some of the problems that you're facing, because actually some of these things have already happened before. And I find it quite interesting, and I think that it gives us a lot to think about, especially as we go forward in terms of whether this has failed or not. Because if some of these instruments and some of this thinking has already been behind us at a time when there wasn't such a priority to empower Black people, it might be interesting and women, it might be interesting to look at that and say, how far did those instruments and those things take us then? And how do we actually look at it now using some of the very similar schemes and trying to take us forward? So I thought that was really interesting, and I'm looking forward to actually delving into more of the detail. But I thought the historical lens, and it's something really important that I had not thought would be important. And also, just to say, of course, I come from Ezibeleni, and I knew a lot of the things that he was talking about. So there's a lot of reflection. My mother used to have a small business in which she used to have to get some of these labor employment incentives, and she used to write a big book from the TTC, or Transkei Development Corporation, in which they would give women like her, some input in terms of their businesses, and they'd be able to hire more people. And some of those things cause some interesting outcomes that perhaps can be reflected on going forward. But thanks very much for that, Abanga, and the rest of the team for the amazing work that actually takes us much further than would have been if we had not actually had these kinds of reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanti. Aya Bonga, I see that David Makema, he poses a question that, he says that massive funds allocated to BEE have ended up in France with initiatives infested in corruption, and what measures are in place to discourage and ensure resources are used productively. I don't know if you want to try and address that and answer any other questions that have arisen.
Thanks a lot for that, Michael. And maybe let me just come in on that question and the tail end of Kandi's comment. I mean, one of the pictures that I tried to share, you know, in the discussion was from the former SCIS Development Corporation, and they used to have that image that was there, a sewing center where women, you know, would receive the kind of support that you were speaking about in the case of SBLA. And I think we haven't done enough to learn from those, aside from just wanting to resuscitate those industrial parks. So that's the one comment I wanted to make on that. But I think to the comment that is being raised around fronting and the type of reinvestment or consumption or lack thereof, I think is a critical tension. And we raised that in the chapeaux paper because without the type of reciprocity between beneficiaries of BEE and the broader imperatives of the National Development Project of reinvestment, of industrial learning, of upgrade, of value addition, you're not going to have BEE evolving in synchronous fashion with the National Development Project. And I think that's the point that we want to underscore. And I think in many ways it helps us in trying to deal with the very difficult question that Megan asked, which is, how do you think about this in the context of the fact that you might just be tinkering and tailoring on the margins of a capitalist system whose nature intrinsically is one of inequality, and race plays a particular function there. And I think if our reading of BEE is just a narrow one, then it's about buttressing capitalism, giving it a bit more melanin. But I think if our progressive and more expansionary reading is allowed to take root, you're likely to get to a bit of a more, I guess, social democratic outcome than maybe just a clear capitalist outcome. And a lot of that has to do with what I argue is reciprocity between the motive forces of BEE, the people who benefit from it, and of course, I guess, the broader society.
Thank you, Aya. I see Victor Khalima says that without structural change and economic growth, it's difficult to think of empowering the majority. How growth is achieved is a matter of debate. And I've always thought that, Mariana Mazzucato likes to say that growth is not just a quantity, it's a direction. There's a size to it. There's the amount of growth, but there's also the direction of growth. And maybe the challenge in South Africa today is it's not clear what the direction is. And therefore, the numbers aren't coming in behind the direction. But it does appear that, to me at least, if we think of growth as a process of structural change, there are two key sectors or two key processes which, whether we like it or not, will be the driving forces of structural change in the years to come. The first is the decarbonization or the transition to some kind of different energy structure. And the second is to digitalization. And in a sense, one might think that part of the challenge in the digitalization space with the auctioning of spectrum and all of those things might be related to an inability of the state to very clearly allocate rents in that process in a way that will balance these questions of productivity growth and transformation and Black empowerment. But on the question of a kind of a green transition, should we be, do we have, I don't know whether to say green and Black or a dark green transition. Does it make sense to conceptualize BEE in abstract, or shouldn't it be conceptualized as an element of a process of structural change, such as decarbonization? And are we thinking about that kind of thing? If there are no audience members who want to come in, I'm going to invite Lumkile back and pose that question to him. Before you come in, Lumkile, I see Tando Vilagazi has raised his hand. So let me go over to you from CRED, and also an author of one of the papers in this suite.
Thanks, Michael. In the end, not, but my colleagues have. I can't see myself, but I hope you can see me. Just a couple of comments. I mean, I think, and also just to welcome the session, but also to welcome the report. I'm quite intrigued by the level of depth and also historical account that's gone into locating a proper BEE debate. A few points, I guess, around where we are and where to from here. I think Uduma raises this in 2006 in his book on this issue of BEE having enriched a few. And one of the points he makes there is the question we should be asking is why is it only enriched so few blacks, in fact, on that, right? So when you look at the numbers, the proportion of this enrichment is actually quite small, and there should have been more, and they weren't. I think part of the issue here is that a few things. So if you look at DTI's strategy in 2003 on BEE, they're very clear to say, look, we have to reinvent BEE so that it's more broad-based. And that means bringing other policy areas, regulators, etc., along in the project, such that the policy itself, BEE, doesn't carry the load of all the other regulators, education policy, employment equity, etc., in one policy, because it simply wasn't designed to do that, nor could it have done all of that, right? It had a very specific focus, arguably, on ownership and economic transformation at the level of the firm, right? And so arguably here, part of the problem has been that with respect, I think perhaps other policy areas have been sleeping on the job. I think there's real questions to be asked of whether our sector economic regulators have pulled their weight. There's real questions to be asked about whether education policy and other areas that were identified in that strategy have pulled their weight as well. And I think it's important in that sense to continue to think about BEE not only in and of itself, but also as a part of a wider nexus of policies with Black economic empowerment considered in small letters, as it were, as opposed to being specifically the policy. Just a couple more points. I think that there's some pockets of interest, at least from our work, that I think are worth also throwing into the pot here. Something like the Black industrialist scheme of the DTIC is an interesting one, because it says, and I think when DG October or former DG October presented this 2016, I think at Parliament, he says this is BEE 2.0. We're now trying to get into the detail of sectors and building these Black owned manufacturing entities that can be part of the process of structural transformation. Quite simply, you cannot require or ask that Black entities participate in manufacturing sectors, in value addition, if those firms didn't exist or weren't sufficiently empowered. And so there's some evidence there that you have these capabilities building slowly in the background. And the question is, what can you do with other rules of the game outside of even this policy to give them that access to the markets, to give them the kind of access? How can you fix procurement from the state and otherwise, private sector as well, to give them that kind of access so that you can start to see a society where we can all actually see serious Black-owned manufacturing and industrial firms contesting markets, because arguably that may well shift the debate from being about ownership, and BEE could be considered more broadly. Lastly here, I think Atkinson speaks about this idea that equity or achieving equity is not necessarily opposed to economic efficiency. And I think that's an important idea. What I've seen, at least in the master plans that we've been involved with, is that the business group, being extremely well organized in these engagements, is still ultimately arguing growth first, inclusion later. I think that a lot of the master plans are following that process and that logic. And I suspect that we'll look back in 10 years and say, oh gosh, we missed another opportunity. So I think the engaging with the details of sectors, existing sectors as well, is going to be important. To only focus on emerging areas, renewables and energy transitions, etc., is simply to accept defeat, that we couldn't change the food and agro-processing sector. We couldn't change the plastic sector, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that won't be good enough in terms of the quantum of change that we seek. Thanks, I've said too much.
Thanks, Thando. Of course, I suppose the manufacturing sector is one of the laggards when it comes to BEE. I think others will correct me if I'm wrong. And perhaps this points to, I mean, one of the connections that we kind of drew out in some of the papers is that while the focus on ownership has been very much concentrated on listed firms, whereas the unlisted sector, which seems to be where firms are migrating to and growing, has seen much less progress. And one could almost argue that where we have seen progress, it's where there's an incentive for private corporations to comply, because they either want to participate in government procurement, or they require a license from government to operate. So the big sectors that require a government license include finance and mining, which are, of course, the listed companies in the main, or constitute a large share of the JSE. But we've been unable to extend this logic into manufacturing and into the unlisted sectors, or the unlisted sectors. So let me ask, maybe Jacob would want to say something about that, but let me bring in Lumkile again and ask, how can we, is Black Industrialist Program enough to shift the focus of empowerment from narrow ownership to industrialization?
It is part, I think, Michael, of a much more bigger effort that is required. I think one of our colleagues participating here talked about power. So in addition to the Black Economic Empowerment Scheme through the Black Industrialist Program, we need also a much sharper change at policy level. You've referred to digitalization, which is pivotal. We know how much power it might have in inclusion. I mean, we felt it here at VETS with many of our students who live in peri-urban as well as rural areas, how they're being marginalized because of that lack of transformation. So there are those areas where I think we can then massify the Black Industrial Program through that. The one comment I want to make, in addition to what I've said, Michael, is one of our former students, a guy called Abong Wakawe, looked at the Transnet procurement program around the capitalization of Transnet. And even the TIC itself showed very well how an opportunity was lost because that was exactly what you're talking about, where it was an opportunity for us to bring the Black Industrial Program much earlier on through the procurement process of Transnet, Eskom, and many others. So what I'm saying is that there will be other opportunities that will come again that provide us to transform the economy structurally, but it is all about power. If those that have got power to change and influence the change don't push it through, we're gonna continue talking the same language every year. So it is pivotal for us that these programs are also informed by a political agenda. The apartheid regime had an apartheid project. So a democratic regime should have a Black industrialist project holistically, not only manufacturing, but across all facets of how we conduct ourselves, in including our people and ensuring that there's no inequality in the long term.
Thank you, Lumkile. And I think if I see no further hands or comments, we left at about with about 2 minutes left, just enough time for me to say thank you all to attending. I hope I would encourage you strongly to have a look at the papers on the website. Maybe Kitso can post the link again. And we also want to thank Open Society Foundation, who played a critical role in providing the resources for this work. And we know that this conversation is ongoing. But let me go back to maybe the first point that Aya made, which is that, in a sense, we can complain as much as we want about BEE, but if it did not exist, we would have to invent it, because there's no other area of policy that we have, or framework of policy, that puts at the center of its thinking issues of economic power, racial redress, and ownership of assets. And those are things, and I think a lot of the history we have discussed today has been an acknowledgement that behind our normal problems of inequality and poverty and unemployment, if you like, extreme but problems that are there everywhere in the world, is a sense in South Africa of an unresolved historical injustice. And we need to approach all of our policy debates with that in the back of our mind, because it will continue. If it's not addressed positively, it will be addressed negatively. And we may be seeing some of the elements of that emerging in our politics recently. So thank you all very much for being here today. And we hope to see you next time, and good evening to you. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you so much. Good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.